Nietzsche wrote on the genealogy of morals as a direct response to his former friend Paul Ries's take on where morality comes from. This book stands out as one of Nietzsche's most focused and structured works. The first essay, Good and Evil, Good and Bad, draws a sharp line between what he calls master morality and slave morality, revealing how strength and decisive action gradually gave way to passivity and nihilism. The second essay, Guilt, Bad Conscience, and the Like, digs into where guilt and punishment actually come from, tracing how justice emerged as a concept and how people internalizing that concept eventually produced what we call the soul. In the third and final essay, Nietzsche tears apart the meaning behind the ascetic ideal. His goal wasn't to simply throw out slave morality, master morality, internalized values, or ascetic ideals. What he actually wanted was to expose the fact that culture and morality aren't timeless truths handed down from above. They were invented by human beings. He opens by admitting we are unknown, we knowers. We've always taken morality as a given without ever digging into its roots. So he goes back through history and asks, under what circumstances did humans create the concepts of good and evil? Do those concepts have any real value? Have they helped or hurt us? For the very first time, the worth of our values was being questioned. In that first essay, Nietzsche makes a bold claim. The idea of good didn't actually start with the people receiving kindness. It started with the aristocratic and high-minded, who simply decided they were good by comparing themselves to the ordinary and low. He called this the pathos of distance, a massive gap separating the noble from everyone else. Nietzsche, widely considered the greatest philologist of his era and a professor by age 24, the youngest on record to this day, traced the etymological roots of good, bad, and evil, and found they all pointed to the same evolution. Good came from the aristocratic and noble, while bad was attached to the common and vulgar. He then separates the priestly class from the warrior aristocrats. Priests were physically weaker, and that physical weakness mutated into something psychologically dangerous. They compensated through knowledge and mental dominance. The Jews, as a priestly people, exemplified this by flipping the entire value system upside down, declaring that the powerful and aristocratic were actually evil, while the poor and weak were good. That's how the slave revolt in morality began, unlike anything the world had ever witnessed, with the herd's morality overthrowing the aristocratic ideal entirely. And here's where ressentiment enters the picture. That inferiority complex, that deep-seated jealousy, transforms into revenge. It targets the very source of the frustration. Slave morality resents the virtues of the powerful. It turns the other cheek. And that translated directly into Christianity's, the meek shall inherit the earth. Nietzsche was disgusted by this. He championed master morality, not as a tool for oppression, but as a force for creating entirely new values and ways of existing. Through self-deception, the resentful man manages to reframe weakness as virtue. Ressentiment became a devastatingly effective weapon against the aristocratic race. Nietzsche saw it as a symbol of humanity's decline, part of a 1,000-year war. Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. There has never been a greater event than that fight. Rome was powerful, aristocratic, dominant. The Jews were the priestly nation of ressentiment. And without any doubt, the Jews won. With Jesus of Nazareth as the ultimate embodiment, Rome was crushed. In the second essay, Nietzsche traces punishment back to a creditor and debtor relationship. He introduces the concept of forgetfulness as an active mental process that keeps us from drowning in the past. To counteract that, we develop memory, which allows us to make promises and take control of the future. That control made humans calculable and responsible. He calls this the morality of custom. Before morality existed, people simply punished promise breakers out of raw anger. Instead of financial compensation, the creditor got satisfaction from inflicting pain on someone powerless. That suffering was the repayment. Cruelty was entertainment. It was genuinely enjoyed. As the old maxim goes, the sight of suffering does one good. The infliction of suffering does one more good. This is where guilt comes from. The German word for guilt, Schuld, directly derives from the word for debt, Schulden. This system of psychological branding is the oldest form of human memory, burning certain I will nots permanently into the mind. The criminal was fundamentally a person who broke their word. But as the community grew more powerful, individual offenses were taken less seriously, the wrongdoer received more protection, and the law became less brutal, culminating in formal legal systems. Nietzsche's will to power runs quietly through the entire book. A more powerful force always subdues a weaker one. That's how history moves. Then there's bad conscience, guilt installed into the offender's mind as a taming mechanism. The ancient man was built for war and wilderness. As society modernized, all his instincts were switched off. He was dropped into an unfamiliar world built on thinking and calculating. Nietzsche wrote, "I do not believe there was ever in the world such a feeling of misery. Every instinct with nowhere to go turns inward." And Nietzsche calls this the internalization of man, what humans eventually named the soul. Bad conscience also emerges between generations. The living feel they owe a debt to their ancestors for the sacrifices made before them, repaid through offerings, temples, and above all obedience. As the tribe's power grows, so does the reverence owed to those ancestors. That fear, Nietzsche suggests, may be the very origin of gods. He closes by envisioning a future figure who will liberate us from the old ideal, the Antichrist and antinihilist Zarathustra the godless. The third essay, What is the Meaning of Ascetic Ideals?, is the longest and most detailed of the three. The ascetic ideal is captured right at the start. The fundamental feature of man's will, his horror of emptiness. He needs a goal, and he will sooner will nothingness than not will at all. Strange statement, but it'll make sense by the end. Asceticism means rejecting earthly pleasures in favor of a stripped-down, self-denying, abstinent existence. Nietzsche ties the ascetic ideal to three words: poverty, humility, and chastity. That ideal means different things to different groups: artists, philosophers, priests, scientists. But the most dangerous enemy of life is the ascetic priest, the church's champion, the shepherd of the sick herd. I suffer. It must be somebody's fault, so thinks every sick sheep. But his shepherd, the ascetic priest, says, "Quite so, my sheep, it must be the fault of someone. But thou thyself art that same one." The ascetic priest doesn't actually heal the psychological depression he tends to. He numbs it with deadening drugs and hypnosis. That's the real physiological engine driving ressentiment. He offers individuals the pleasure of communal thriving as an emotional painkiller. And out of this, sin is born, the greatest turning point in the history of the diseased soul. Yet Nietzsche still has a measure of respect for the ascetic priest, because he does prescribe a small dose of the most life-affirming force, the will to power. The herd's drive toward cooperation inevitably produced the will to power. That collective organization was a genuine advance in the war against depression. Nietzsche then delivers a striking critique of modern science and its obsessive worship of truth, while simultaneously claiming to reject metaphysics, when in fact it doesn't. Remove God and a new problem surfaces. What is the value of truth itself? With the Enlightenment, existence has become more random, casual, and superfluous in the visible order of the universe. Science and the ascetic ideal are secretly allies because they both treat truth as something beyond questioning. What's actually needed, Nietzsche argues, is a full critique of truth as a value. Even our belief in truth must be put on trial. He points toward a new ideal, one that doesn't demand truth at all costs, one that isn't opposed to the ascetic ideal but represents its final stage of evolution. Christianity, ironically, built a self-destroying mechanism right into itself that eventually dismantled it. The ascetic ideal was simply a tool for filling the enormous void surrounding human life, giving meaning to suffering. Any meaning, no matter how dark, is preferable to none. It closed the gap of nihilism, but it also injected a newer and more toxic form of suffering: guilt. Even so, it saved man. It is a will for nothingness, a will that opposes life, but it is still a will. Man will always choose to will nothingness rather than not will at all.